How's everybody doing? Welcome back to another episode of the CNC on CFB show. I guess notably today, it's the C show. My co-host Connor, unfortunately unable to make today's episode due to some scheduling conflicts. But nonetheless, you get to hear me give some picks, discuss this weekend slate. Really interesting, some really good games. And without further ado, let's just get into Connor's in spirit representation here with Connor's question: how many reasonable scenarios are there which two teams from the same conference make the CFP? Look, I've gone back and forth a lot of thought into reasonable, quote unquote, and that's the key word here, reasonable scenarios whereby two teams from the same conference get in here. And look, I think you go back to what I've said previously on the show. I think the Big Ten, they're going to ultimately have the college football playoff title winner or the Pac 12. But I only see one of those two conferences realistically having a two-team representation in the top four, ultimately in the CFP, and that's the Big Ten. I think there's a reasonable shot we see both Ohio State and Michigan in the top four. The only scenario, though, within that, I think, is if Michigan runs the table and wins the Big Ten, because given where Ohio State currently positioned number one in the country here, assuming that their only loss ends up being to Michigan and they're a one-loss team, I think they realistically, their floor, they slide down right to about that fourth spot, and they're the last team to get in. Michigan, if they control their own destiny, which they absolutely do, I think Michigan, in theory, running the table, winning the Big Ten, I think obviously that locks them a spot. I don't think vice versa would be reasonable, especially considering Michigan plays host to Ohio State this year, and couple that with Michigan, all that's kind of laying over their head here, all the stallions, the scandal. I think it would just be too easy for the CFP to kind of sort of informally kind of overlook that in how they ultimately maybe view Michigan if they are kind of knocking on that door for that last spot. So that's my first scenario, and probably most likely, I guess, two-team scenario I see is potential Ohio State 4 seed and Michigan if they run the table. And like I said, I don't see a Pac-12 two-team scenario with Washington and Oregon effectively, because I think there's just too much carnage that will take place. Look, you look at our episode that we just recorded earlier this week. There's so much carnage in the Pac-12 that I think we potentially see a realistic scenario where there's a 2-loss Pac-12 winner. Look, Washington is rattling off the first of 3 top 20 ranked opponents this weekend, the first of 3, 2 of which are away. I think there's at least 1 loss still on their schedule. And then equally with Oregon, Oregon still has 2 ranked opponents left, a top 20 on their schedule. And there's just so much. I mean, the Pac-12, it's the best, top to bottom conference this season. I just think there's very reasonable potential for so much carnage to take place in that conference, to the tune of maybe there's just a 2-loss conference title winner, which that would be really bad, I think, for the conference, because in that event, I don't know if that guarantees really a spot in the top 4 whatsoever. And hence now I transition into 2 scenarios that I actually reasonably see, whereby the SEC has 2 teams in the playoff. Yes, you heard me right, the SEC. I think we potentially see, of course, Georgia. And given that they're the 2 team right now, I think going into title weekend, I think they're at worst the second ranked team in the terms of the eye of the CFP. But there's easily a chance where I think they're the number 1 ranked team heading into conference title weekend. And look, this game this SEC West clash with both Bama and LSU, I think, is for pretty much all the marbles. And look, call me crazy. I think both LSU and Bama have a chance to get in theory, to that ultimately what would be that fourth spot into the playoff because of the fact that obviously the opportunity of this game, you got eighth ranked Bama playing host to LSU, who I think will get into the, just discussing the top four games this week, in my view, and then best bets even. But I think LSU, if they go into Tuscaloosa and get a big win, they're easily in the top 10 in theory next ranking. And with them running then the table these last four games, of course, including first a win against Bama, LSU gets into the title game, SEC title game, and if they beat a number 1 or number 2 ranked Georgia, I think LSU has as good a case of anybody to come into that fourth spot, because I could easily see a Washington, Oregon 2-win Pac-12 winner versus LSU or Bama SEC winner. I think specifically against LSU, I think LSU, their course of having to beat the number 1 or number 2 ranked team, I think that gets some favor over a potential 2-loss Oregon or Washington team. LSU, I think, could reasonably sneak in with Georgia into the college football playoff. And then, of course, I think it's intuitive. Bama already being ranked 8th, I think there's a reasonable shot, if they run the table and they get into the SEC title game and they beat Georgia, I think they absolutely deserve that fourth spot. And really where that leaves, I think, the rest of the CFP, for especially with these SEC scenarios, is absolutely either Michigan or Ohio State winning the Big Ten. I think more reasonably it would basically be Ohio State winning Ohio State winning the Big Ten, and then the other CFP spot going to a undefeated FSU team. And look, I think there's still, in terms of teams that potentially have a shot, I think Texas, Oklahoma maybe have a shot, but I just don't believe in the Big 12 ultimately, and the strength of the Big 12, and especially when it comes maybe down to the eyes of the committee. I don't know. So call me crazy. Those are my 3 scenarios of 2 team from one conference. Reasonable. Again, tell me in the comments how unreasonable you maybe think these are, but that's what I think could happen reasonably in terms of chaotic CFP 2-team conference representations. Now let's just dive into, in my view, the top 4 games for this weekend. And I think, look, the theme, quite honestly, simple enough. We're talking ranked bouts here. And first, I guess, keeping in with the SEC theme, look, we'll start East here. Georgia, number 2 versus number 12 in Missouri. I think this means just so much for Georgia to really, I think, maybe jump right back to number 1 in next CFP on next Tuesday's rankings. Just a big opportunity for Georgia, equally for Mizzou. But I just see Georgia taking care of business nonetheless here, and really just reaffirming their status as probably the best team, maybe deserving of the number 1 spot, I think. But transitioning, look, I just said the Big 12, I'm not a huge believer. If Texas is able to get a win against K-State here, a Kansas State team that just now cracked it back in the top 25, a very respectable team for sure. We saw how good they were last season. But if Texas is able to get a win against K-State here, and if they're just able to hold on really in time for, potential Quinn Ewers return, whenever that might be, although who knows, if Malik Murphy is lighting it up, does Quinn really even make it a no-brainer decision to let him back in and regain the reins there behind center? But with how Malik looked last week, it's maybe not. Quinn Ewers, when he's healthy, that's looking like he's going to step right back in, right? But look, if Texas gets a win here, they're, I think, number 7, they can really start to build a case where they're knocking on the door I just, I don't know. I don't, I don't know. K State, they're riding some momentum here. I just don't. I'm not so confident in this game, or maybe Texas's chances for the remainder of the season to stay on the to win out. Excuse me, and then equally, I think with Oklahoma. But hence my three scenarios that I deem reasonable that I just covered. Anyway, the another top four game, in my view. Look, we're staying in the SEC, or going back to the SEC, excuse me. LSU, Bama. I've kind of already dove into that and the significance of this. I mean, such a huge, huge, huge playoff implication for either winner here. I think really almost creating your own destiny to a potential 4 seed in the CFB to get almost like a backdoor cover into the college football playoff for either team. I wholeheartedly believe, even though LSU has 2 losses, you just heard me walk through my reasonable scenario. But yeah, unbelievable matchup in Tuscaloosa. I'll touch on who I think is going to come out with a win just in a little bit here. One of my best bets. But rounding out the top 4 biggest games of the week, I think we got to go to the Pac-12 and Washington against Caleb Williams and the USC Trojans. I think this is going to be such a huge opportunity for Washington to really kind of stay punching and fighting with that in terms of with the undefeated teams, quite frankly. And they have simply a gauntlet. They have an absolute gauntlet. I think technically by some metrics, Oregon's the more reasonable route to the playoff in terms of their chances percentage-wise right now at this point in time, because of the fact that Oregon has a little bit of an easier run-in. But then again, the Pac-12 is the Pac-12 this season, and there's so much chaos that can carnage, right, that we've just talked about earlier this week, that can happen week to week. So nonetheless, Washington, this is a huge, huge, huge game for them to stay undefeated. And so that's the reality of how I see this week in terms of the top 4 most significant games. Definitely some other under-the-radar games, and some interesting, of course, betting slates, scenarios. And look, with that said, best bets presented to you from the Fade Gods. But jokes aside, I'll just rattle through Connor's best bets here. And for Connor's, represented in spirit here with UCF minus 3.5, Liberty minus 15, last but not least, Old Dominion +1. Those are Connor's trio of best bets. For mine, look, I'll get right into it. I think LSU goes into Tuscaloosa and takes care of business and wins. I'm going LSU outright. Give me LSU money line in Tuscaloosa. You're going to get some plus money there for sure. And for my next picks, I got to go Colorado. I'm riding the hot hand, the correct pick that I got last week for the first time in a couple weeks, I guess. But Colorado covering the 13.5 at home against Oregon State. Look, I'm even down to sprinkle a little bit of money line against Oregon State. Oregon State, potential rebound game for them, or potential still not able to right the ship game for Oregon State. But I like Colorado this weekend to at least cover the 13.5. And then last but not least, look, talked about them already ad nauseum. I think Washington makes a statement against USC, silences some doubters, and really just catapults them, I think, into the top 4, potentially. And so what does that mean? I have Washington to cover the -3. At USC, I don't think it's going to be a huge home field advantage in any event, but there you have it. Some best bets, some little recap and review of this weekend's slate, and some really interesting, hopefully you deem thoughtful analysis on reasonable 2-team from one conference playoff scenarios. Guys, drop a like, drop a comment for the Fade God picks. Have a great weekend. Gamble responsibly. Peace.